Good morning. My name is Walter Whetstone. I'm one of the foresters with the center. For the next session, I'm going to introduce first up David Bourgeois, our field operations manager, who's going to talk about the importance of boundary lines.
Good morning. Thank you for all being here this morning, and those of you who are visiting us virtually. Rajan stole a little bit of my thunder when he was talking this morning. The first part of the symposium, I was hearing a lot of people who, talking about how, things we can't change. And being the optimist that I am, I want to talk a little about some things that we can change and control. But first, a guy named E.F. Schumacher once wrote, "I myself cannot raise the winds that will blow us or this ship into a better world. But I can at least put up a sail so that when the wind comes, I can catch it." Now, we can't control the weather that's going to make our trees grow faster or slower. And we can't control the timber markets and how much our wood is going to be worth. And we can't force a logger or a timber buyer to buy or cut our timber. But there are some things that we can do. And if you own land, you have boundary lines. And if you have boundary lines, that's something that you can actually do something about and should, because this could pay you big dividends now and in the future. So with that, boundary lines, why are they important? How can I find them? How can I maintain them? Next slide, please. So boundary lines, everybody has them, but a lot of people don't know where they are. When you go to a logger or a timber buyer, he's going to want to know where your land is. He has to know where your land is so that he knows what he's purchasing. Next slide, please. And I also like to refer to actual pictures that I've taken on the tracts that I have visited while I've been working here. And this is one of them over in Colleton County. And I'm looking straight down a boundary line, but as you can see in that picture, it all just looks like woods. So if I take a buyer or a logger out here and say, here's the timber I want to sell, which tree is yours? I need to know that because I have to know what I'm buying before I can offer any kind of a price. And it'll actually kind of scare off somebody if you can't really show them that you know where your lines are. Next slide, please. So this is an actual tract map. You might not be used to looking at aerial photos, but if you look at the blue line in that picture, there's like a triangle that goes into a cornfield from this landowner's property. This is where a farmer's been planting and harvesting corn or soybeans or whatever for as long as he's been doing it. And the landowner has never been paid anything for that. There's never been any compensation. And this, I said, this guy's on your land. And you'd be kind of surprised at how much I see this. When I look at an aerial photo and I see a line that goes halfway through a cornfield or on the edge, well, that's your land that he's using. You should be getting paid some lease money for that. Or in a case like this is the perfect time for you to establish where is your boundary. You need to don't wait, contact this farmer. There's another part of that picture. I have the arrow going to it. Somebody is actually maintaining and mowing a yard. And I went out there with my GPS and I'm standing on my phone showing me where I am. I'm clearly within this guy's property, and yet I'm standing out in somebody's yard. You need to fix that. If you don't want to wait for that, because if somebody does that long enough, they'll say, well, yeah, my parents always used this yard and their parents always used it. And, eventually people just assume that's your land. Next slide, please. Here's another example, different place, same county. Once again, farmer, this guy only has about an 8-9 acre tract, something like that. The PVC you see in the dashed line is where the landowner and I went out there and marked his boundary. He fortunately, an old survey when they did an older survey, they had put in 2 T-posts that we could line up and get what we call a line of sight, where if you're looking past there, and then I could have him move right or left with a PVC pipe, put it in the ground, and then go further, 100 yards further, 200 yards further, and we can establish a pretty good line. Not a surveyor, but I'm I know him pretty close if I come to the boundary corner on the other side, and I'm pretty close to it. And so he's now the area on the left where it has brown grass, that was an area that was cut over that he replanted. And this area on the right, you might say, well, you know, that's only like an acre or two. Well, I remember Steve presented earlier, that acre or two might not mean much, but if you're not being paid anything for the guy leasing it to you, and when you come to rotation, and that could be $3,000 in your pocket, $3,000 in your pocket is better than $3,000 in his pocket. At least that's the way I look at it. Next slide, please. This is the same field at age 1, and already you can see the trees are almost hip high. Next year, those trees will be up overhead. This guy's starting to make money on his land like he should have been doing for the last, 20 years or so. Next slide, please. So how do I figure out where my boundaries are? And this can be, a lot of people would have no idea how to do this. Well, if you can put your hands on a survey, or if someone in the family has a survey, you go to the county and find an old survey. It doesn't have to be a new one. There's an awful lot of information on there if you know what you're looking at. So if we start at the top, you have a scale, and it shows you, like 1 inch on the map equals so many feet on the ground. And that's kind of important. Looking at this tract, you might say, well, that's not very far. I can walk through the woods from here to there. Well, it might be a half a mile through thick woods. It might not be as easy as you think. But you do want to know a scale. And if you have a starting point, you can do a lot more. The legend is the most, back to that one. Legend is the most important thing. On there, they'll have little codes. You probably can't read it from there, but commonly found codes are R for, and they'll explain what they are. It might be R for rebar, C for cement post, P for pipe, or 1 inch, 1P, and it'll say either I for installed. In other words, when that survey was done, if it was RI, it would be rebar installed, or if it was RF, it was rebar found. We found a 1/2 inch rebar. So think about if you're out in the woods and you're looking for your corners, there's a lot of stuff growing out there. If you know what you're looking for, hey, I'm looking for this 4 inch post, or I'm 4x4 post, or I'm looking for a bar, it makes a whole lot of difference. The other thing that is fascinating to me is how many different things that you can find out there that people have used over time to mark their corners. The other thing that the line has on it is the last thing down there is bearing and distance. So if you can find that corner, and oftentimes near the road, people still know where their corners are, or you might have a neighbor, you might not know where the corner is, but you ask your neighbor, oh yeah, my grandfather had a pipe in there and here's where it is. If you have that and it tells you go 1,500 feet in this direction, if you get a compass, you can figure out what that direction is. Or if you have an iPhone or any phone, there's actually a compass thing on there that you could use, and you could figure out, if I follow this direction so many feet, I can find that other boundary corner. So that's another good tool to use. Next slide, please. So when you're actually in the woods, it gets a little different. If you're not used to being in the woods, you might not like that at all. One thing I would suggest is don't go looking for your boundary corners in August, because you might find them, but you might find some snakes and mosquitoes and yellow jackets and things that you don't want to find. But the most important thing is, if you go in the wintertime or on a cool day after the leaves have fallen and things are down, it's far easier to locate something like this, because think about a piece of rebar, a little piece of metal pipe that's rusted. It's not going to be that easy. Here's some clues you can look for in the woods. Note on that tree that there are these 3 scars. When a surveyor puts in a corner, he will mark hash marks on what's called a witness tree. If you find 3 marks, and oftentimes if the corner is where I am, there'll be a tree over here with 3 hash marks and a tree over here. And those things can last for 50 years, 100 years. You can actually find evidence of a chop mark, survey chops, they call them. Another thing that you might find, actually in that picture flagged down at the bottom, is the pipe for that is witnessing. Another thing that you can find is where you have a single chop mark. And if you're going through the woods and you think you're on line and you see a tree with 1 hash mark about, this high, oftentimes that means that the surveyor put his line on this side of that tree. Or if it's a tree over here, you know that the line is on that side of the tree. You can tell by the hash mark. So those are some things to look for in the woods. Next slide. And as I was telling you, some very interesting things. You don't know where they come from. This one on the top left is an old piece of railroad line. Like someone had light gauge rail. I don't know if it was from an old logging railroad or where it came from, but someone used that. It's something sturdy, going to last for, hundreds of years probably. This one on the right, there's a granite block, beautiful granite blocks, and this is actually on the land of one of our landowners, Robert Middleton. But I talked to a surveyor who used to work for Westvaco in the 1980s, and some guy who worked for him said that these granite blocks were actually put in there in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That thing is still as obvious as it can be today. He said that they would have a survey crew come through the woods and do the survey, and then they would leave markers, and then another crew would come in behind them with a mule carrying these huge stone markers and putting them in the ground. I'm sure they plan on being on that land for 100 years, but you can still today find evidence of things like that. This other one was like a bent, something from an axle or some kind of a farm implement where they had this heavy steel. And I was told that heavy steel like that is treasured by people who make knives and stuff, is extremely hard and lasts forever. But you'll be surprised. You might have fun going out and looking for your boundaries because you never know what you're going to find. Next slide, please. Here's another little clue that I think Trey Bailey might have taught me, and I heard another landowner telling me that he has seen this. When you're going through the woods and you think you're on line, people a lot of times in the low country here, it's low country, they would run a ditch along their boundary line, or a lot of people would use fire lines that they're not going to protect somebody else's property, they're protecting theirs. So they would have, you would find the remnants, it's very hard to see, but you find remnants of this old ditch line, and many times that is where the line is. Next slide, please. This is hard to see in this light. I threw this in at the end, but this is something to think about. Inside those red lines, if you could see it better, there are obvious lines of pine trees. If you're on the ground and you think you're on your line and you see pine trees that appear to be in straight rows over here, and the land over here is just coming up with a mix of pine and hardwoods, or they're all pines and they're just not in lines, you can deduce that might have been cut at the same time, but someone planted a forest here and this forest came up naturally. When you're walking through the woods, some of these things are much more obvious than finding a rebar in the middle of the woods. But you can say, okay, that's probably this land and that's probably this land. And many times you'll find remains of old. I've plenty of times found barbed wire that's in a tree, and I say, okay, I must be on line because the barbed wire is right here and I'm following this bearing. Next slide. And so surveys, I'm all for surveys, but I want to let you know they're very expensive. Trey's going to talk about the value of a survey, and I believe in a survey. However, if you have any way of finding your boundary lines, you can save yourself an awful lot of money, and if you like being outdoors, you might have a little fun. And you can do this with some simple tools. You have pin flags. I talked about sighting. If you're online and you want to keep a straight line, it's far more difficult than you think to do that. But one thing you can do is you go from this known point further ahead, and then you keep following that straight line, and you put a pin flag in that you sight over the top of those so that you're following a straight line the whole way until the line curves. A compass, I talked about compass and pacing. You might also use your phone, but a compass is probably more accurate. A machete, because generally you're going to need to cut brush, not that you have to have a highway through the woods, but so that you have a line of sight to know that you're on this straight line. And then a measuring tape. Measuring tape, they have these 200-foot, 300-foot measuring tapes, which might not help you in the deep woods, but if you have some short lines and a starting point to find, if I know that I only have to go 300 feet to get from this point to that point, and that's what my survey says, I can pull this tape out and I absolutely know I'm on a straight line, and I can run an arc, and somewhere along that arc, that other corner is going to be there. Next slide. So the other thing, as I mentioned, is surveys are expensive. If you do have a survey done, critically important to keep up that boundary line. Painting boundary, it doesn't have to be. They do make tree paint. Forestry suppliers will sell you tree paint, cans of paint that you spray. It's extremely convenient, lasts a long time, made for the woods. But if you paint that half bathroom and you got a half a can of paint left, go out there with a throwaway brush, paint on your trees, you know, and follow those lines, paint your chop marks, paint your corners. And that way, you know, 3 or 5 years from now, that flagging that we put out there is easy to see and it works great, but it's not going to be there 5 years from now. You know, you'd be very lucky to find that. I go to places I flagged 2 years ago, and if, depending on the weather, how much sunlight's hitting it, that stuff degrades. But if you put paint out there around your boundaries, you're going to be able to, and show them to your kids. This is one of our landowners who went out with me to paint some lines. Another thing is, you know, try to get to know your neighbors. As I said, you might save yourself before you go get a survey. Find out, you know, has this land been surveyed recently? Another thing you can check is if you have land next to some forestry company like Westvaco, any industrial forest company, they pay a lot of money to maintain their lines. So you're a very lucky person. If you have lines up against one of them, you can at least find those corners, and that can be a starting point to find the rest of your corners. Next slide, please. And you can either, let's hold on the questions, and I'm going to let Trey Bailey, other center forester, is going to come up and talk about timber and the reasons, some of the reasons why we need to have good boundaries when we go harvest our timber. Trey?
Good morning. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. A little bit about myself. My name's Trey. I'm a forester here with the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. A little background on myself. Steve mentioned earlier, I came from a consulting background. So I did private consulting before I started working with the center. And a lot of what I did was timber sale and timber management for landowner tracts, long-term management for tracts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about timber sales. Before we get started, basics of timber sales is kind of a, if you sold timber before, you know it's kind of a oxymoronic statement because there's nothing basic about a timber sale. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we have talked with landowners about that you may want to know more information on, and some of the ins and outs and the small details of timber sales. Timber sales is also an incredibly broad topic. So we're going to focus in a little bit, and I feel free to ask any questions when we get towards the end. So next slide, please. All right, so what we're going to cover today is we're going to cover some common language, talk about what a timber sale actually is. What do I need to do to sell my timber? What do I need to have to sell my timber? How much timber do I actually need? What is a stand? Product classes, types of sales, and then a little bit on future plans because preservation is in our name. So we want to preserve it for future generations. So we're going to talk a little bit about future plans towards the end. So next slide, please. So here's some common language. You're going to hear me say this. This is actually a landowner tract that I wrote a management plan for up in Williamsburg County. Well, tract, so when you hear the word tract, we're talking about an expanse of land. So we're talking about the whole piece of land. There's not really a acreage measurement that goes with tract because tract is interchangeable. So the tract are all of those stands. You see there are 5 stands in this picture. That's that red outline. That is the tract of land. Stand is the management unit. Generally, it is the same type of composition. It'll be managed under the same management regime. That would be what a stand is. So within this tract, there are 5 stands. So when I talk about some of the things today, management of your tract or selling of a timber stand, that I just wanted to make that clear before we jump in this. So next slide, please. So what is a timber sale? We're going to start here. This may look like a very exaggerated picture, but I did want to make this clear. There is money exchanged in both of these pictures. But here's the big difference. The picture on the left, somebody pays you to take those trees. The pictures on the right, you pay somebody to take those trees. Okay? So a timber sale is a larger operation. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about what size tract. But the big difference here is timber sale is on the left, tree removal is on the right. Okay? That's the big difference here. All right, next slide, please. All right, so a tract. Steve talked a little bit about earlier, so I think he had a question from back here, this corner of the room, about the size of tracts, or maybe it was online. But anyway, the tract size can vary for a timber sale. There's a lot of factors that go into that. It could be the type of timber you have. If you have 100 acres of non-merchantable timber, that sale could be much harder to sell than 10 acres of old growth pine. It can vary so much. So there's not like a tract size necessarily, but the South Carolina Forestry Commission says 10 acres is the basis of management. That's what everything that they do. So when they do forest stewardship plans, which is a service the South Carolina Forestry Commission provides, they base it off of a 10-acre tract. So 10 acres is what they view as sustainable management for that tract of land. And the South Carolina Tree Farm says 10 forested acres to actually become tree farm certified. So you could have 10-acre tract, but 5 of it's in fields and houses. You have to have 10 acres to be a part of the tree farm forested acreage. So that's a little bit about that. Clustering is something I added down here at the bottom. Clustering is what Steve talked about earlier. So we have in the past been able to work with landowners, say it's family land that has gone through and has been partitioned out. And there are 6 6-acre tracts that are contiguous. So they're all together, they're under the same management. Total, it might be 36 acres worth of timber. That is something that we call clustering. If all of the landowners are under the same agreement, that they want to be managed under the same way, and they're all in agreement for everything that's going to happen for the property, we could cluster those tracts and you could actually work together. And there's been other situations where it may not be contiguous, but say it's 9 acres here and 25 acres over here, and there's a little bit of space, not much, but a little bit of space between it. We've been able to cluster those tracts together and work together. A lot of these acreage sizes really are there because of the equipment necessary to do forestry. So if you think about a timber sale, everything that you've seen with timber sales, you've got a machine that cuts the trees. It's called a feller buncher. So it's a really large machine with a grapple on the front that grabs the trees, and it's a circular saw that cuts the tree at the base. So you've got that piece of equipment. You have a skidder that has a hook on the back. This is traditional logging. There's other types of things, but you have a skidder that has a hook on the back that basically hooks the trees behind it and drags it across the ground. You may have more than one on a job, depending on the size job. So you might have 2. You have the loader, where it's the knuckle boom. I'll show you a picture of one in a few minutes. They'll have a knuckle boom that actually loads the trucks. Then you have all of the log trucks, and potentially, depending on the job, if they have to push out roads, a lot of times you'll see loggers show up with a bulldozer. So when you think about all the equipment necessary to come to a tract, if you've got 2 acres of land, it's usually not profitable for the logger. And they're running a business, so they have to make sure they're taking care of themselves while they take care of you. So that's where clustering kind of comes in here. So what does not qualify for a timber sale? We'll just review this one more time. Tree removal. Tree removal out your yard is not a timber sale. Somebody's gonna get paid, but it's not you. 2 acres behind your house is also not considered a timber sale unless clustered together. And then small tracts of land that need to be brushed or cleared. There's a big difference between timber sale and cutting the trash off of your property to be able to plant timber. One is timber sale, one is site prep. So that's the big difference between the two. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit about what do I need to sell my timber. We get this question a lot here at the center. So I just want to review this. First and foremost, here at the Center for Heirs Property, clear title. That is the most important thing that you can have when you're selling your timber. In reference to what we were talking about, a lot of timber buyers, consultants, especially if they're reputable, if you do not have clear title, they are not going to purchase that timber. They're going to want you to get clear title first. There are ways to do it, but it is very cumbersome and it's not easy. So clear title is what we're gonna require. We encourage not selling your timber because it could open it up. Because you might have family that says, I don't want anything to do with this property. I'm not worried about it. Well, bring money onto the scene to see if that changes. You got people come out of the woodwork and say, hey, I actually own part of this property. So where's my check? So clear title, knowing who the money's going to and how is incredibly important. Agreement among all the landowners, if it is a multiple owner, so say you own it with your siblings or you own it with your cousin. Agreement, because I've been in the timber business for quite some time. When you cut the tree, it's a lot harder to stand it back up. So once you cut it, it is done. That tree is dead. So you can't stand it back up once it's cut. A recent survey, so Dave talked a little bit about boundary lines. I'm going to talk about in the field in a few minutes. It's great to have a survey on paper. It's more important to have a survey on the field. and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Contract is incredibly important. Word of mouth timber deals are bad timber deals. So we're going to talk a little bit about contracts, property description information, access to your property, and I would encourage a valuation of your asset. So you know when they come and cut the property, what are they actually cutting? How do I know that I'm getting paid for what I actually own? And then I would encourage a consultant and a reforestation plan, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. So next slide, please. Contract. So we're going to start with a contract. This is a picture of a contract. It's just a sample contract. There are good contracts out there. There are good templates for that. If you work with a consultant or you work with a timber buyer, they're going to bring you a contract to sign. What's important about this contract is it outlines a lot of things, but some big ones. Price. What is the stumpage price that you are receiving for the species on your tract? And do you actually have the species on your tract? So most timber buyers are reputable people. Most consultants are reputable people. They're not out to get you. They have a job. They're just trying to provide wood for the mill. However, I have seen in cases before where there will be a big ticket price where it's like, oh, I'm going to pay you $28 a ton for hardwood saw timber, and I'm going to pay you $15 a ton for pine saw timber. You might have 2 trees out there that are hardwood saw timber, and it's sort of like a shock factor, but you don't have that on your property, so that price is irrelevant. It doesn't actually matter. The price that matters is the price for the timber in which you have on your property. It outlines the time frame. So how long do I have to cut it? Is it going to be a year-long contract with a 6-month wet weather clause where it says, hey, if it rains and we can't get in there and maintain BMPs, best management practices that loggers have to maintain and foresters have to maintain? Do we have a 6-month clause or a 3-month clause to be able to get back in and actually cut the property to maintain our end of the contract and your end of the contract? Or you don't want to just sign one that says you can cut this whenever you feel like it. You know, this is a 10-year contract. You wouldn't want to sign something like that necessarily because prices could fluctuate across the 10 years. And you're not going to find somebody that's going to sign that for you either. So payments. So who is paying whom, how, and when? That is incredibly important. How am I getting my money? How are you giving it to me? How frequent are you giving it? Are you giving me every other week if it's a long-term job? Are you going to give it to me on Friday? How are you paying me? And when should I expect that? And then your mill tickets. When it comes into the mill, am I going to see proof that it actually went to the mill? How much did it weigh? How am I getting paid? All that kind of stuff. And then expectations for the job. When you're done logging my property, I had a nice rocked road. When you left, it was a mess. Are you fixing that? And that's stuff that you can put in the contract. You can put in the contract, hey, I would like my roads to be left in the exact same condition or better conditions than when you started. And that's something you can put in your contract. What type of harvest? Are you doing a clear cut? Are you doing a thinning? Is it a selective harvest? Are you going to stay out of what area? And that's in that contract. And then, of course, your grounds to terminate. Say, hey, they've not met the expectations, or you have not met the expectations that they have asked of you. We can terminate this contract. So that would be grounds to terminate. Those are the important aspects. I cannot encourage more. Do not sell timber to your friend just because he's your friend. Friends change when money comes on the scene. So make sure you have that contract to protect yourself and them. Okay? All right. Next slide, please. Property lines. So property lines are incredibly important for various operations. I'm going to specifically talk about property lines for timber sales. So what you see here in this picture, you got 2 pictures here, one on the left. So that's 3 marks on that. What that means is there's a corner somewhere on this side, where I'm standing, on this side of that property line. That's where the property line is. And you can see Dave talked about not having a highway in the woods. You're not going to have a highway in the woods, but you can see that's a clear sight line. The important part about that is if somebody goes down that property line, they can turn around and see, hey, I'm still on that property line. That is a very well-maintained property line. That's probably like a West Vago property line. Not every line is going to look like that, but for this purpose, that's what you have there. And then I wanted to point out in the right picture, there's a white PVC pipe. Now, that white PVC pipe might be marking the corner. However, that is not the legal marker of that corner. At the very base of that down at the very bottom, if I could walk over, I'd show you, but down at the very bottom of that, there's about an inch tall rebar. This is a property line that we found while we were in the woods. There's about an inch tall rebar. That is the property line. So if that white PVC is gone, that still is the property line, that little tiny piece of rebar that's down at the ground. So that's incredibly important about making sure you know where those are. And that's why it's so difficult to find them, because that is the legal marker. So the property lines, the purpose of them are really to know where to start cutting and where to stop cutting. Because in South Carolina, you can, if you cut over a line, it's possible that you could pay damages up to 3 times stumpage price. 3 times stumpage price is a lot of money. So you could be liable for that. Someone could be liable for cutting over on you, and let alone not only just the price. If you're managing your timber, and say you have your property that you manage, and someone cuts over onto you, they have now interrupted your management scheme, depending on how much they cut. Say you have a 10-acre tract and they cut over 3 acres. They just cut 30% of your property. While you still could get triple stumpage for that, you lost 30% of that property if they cut 3 acres out of your 10. On the ground evidence is better than the paper evidence. It's great to have a nice, pretty map. But if you get on the ground and you can't place the map on the ground, it doesn't matter. So making sure you have that on the ground. Something important to note about property lines: don't chop your chop lines. If you have chop marks on your trees, don't go back out and chop them. You can paint around them, but don't chop them, because a surveyor is the only person that can put in corners and chop lines in South Carolina. So do not go back and chop them. You can paint above them. You can put flags all around them. You could, if you want to put a nice fence around them, you can too, but just don't go and chop them yourself, because you don't want to mess up the evidence that's on the ground, that's there for you. And you can't move your property corner. So if you're out there and you're like, man, I wish my yard had just a little bit more, you can't go out there and move your yard. that is the legal property corner for your yard. Okay. And then the implication for timber management is I was a consultant for years. And whenever we went to a job that had I'm not used to standing behind this podium. I'm trying to move. Whenever I would go to a job that I was doing a timber sale on, there wasn't a clear property line. We had a good estimate. So we saw either an old ditch, or we saw a timber type change, or there was something different with the management. We could infer that the line was close to here. What we would do then is back off 10 to 20 feet to cover ourselves, because we as a consultant could also be liable, to cover ourselves to make sure we're well within the boundary line. So just say, we jump over 10 feet and you're on a 200-foot line. You just lost 2,000 square feet of timber, which could affect your pocket. It will affect your pocket. If there's good timber along that line, you're going to lose money. So you don't want to lose money over something as small as a boundary line. Okay? Next slide, please. Property description. So this is actually a picture of a management plan that was written by Mr. Sam Cook. This is a property. The reason I show this for the forestry management plan side is there's a lot of things from the landowner side that are incredibly helpful to know. The consultant, he may be new with you. He may have actually written this plan, so then it's easier for you. But say he doesn't. Say they don't know this. Or say the timber buyer that comes to you and is buying your property or your timber off your property doesn't know this. The important things are, what's the property history? Was this timber ever harvested before? It gives you a good idea of what kind of timber you have out there, or how old this timber may be. If you harvested it, 30 years ago, okay, this is probably 28 to 29-year-old timber. So you have a good idea of what kind of product classes you're going to be working with. What was the previous land use? Were there ag fields? Were there cow pastures? And a lot of that matters, because there could be, say you had a cow pasture, there's going to be fence probably somewhere in your property. Nothing makes a logger more mad than running their saw through a cow fence. A cow fence, as small as it is, will tear up the teeth in those little saw head. It has movable teeth that they can rotate. If they hit a line and it breaks one of those teeth, they have to shut the whole operation down and change those teeth out. The operation shuts down. Your timber doesn't get cut. So things like that could matter. Any type of disease in the past. So we're going to talk in a minute about the different types of sale, whether it's clear cut or whether it's thinning. There's a disease called root rot fungicinosis. So essentially what this is on a thinning. If your property is cut, you have to make sure we know when we're cutting your timber, will root rot be a problem here? Root rot is spread through fungus that then when a tree is cut, it'll move to the stump of that tree. The stump of that tree, the dead tree, will now then spread it. If the roots are grafted with the neighboring trees around it, it could end up killing the other trees. So there's a treatment that you can do by spraying a chemical after it's cut, or cut during hot seasons, that help maintain that. But if we don't know that, it's possible that a few months after your trees are cut, you start noticing that tree's dead, and that tree's dead, or this tree looks like it's dying. That's the important stuff to know when we're coming in to do a cut. Are there land markers I should know about? So are there structures on the property? Are there cemeteries on the property? Are there trash piles? Are there wetlands that we need to know about? Areas that should be avoided? Is there a pecan orchard? Is grandpa's favorite tree out there? Because people get upset if you cut grandpa's tree. So is the grandpa's favorite tree out there? Is there a food plot? Is there a well? Things that you need to know about, because it is not a fun day when a tractor tire falls down into a well. Next slide, please. So here's some pictures. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that. On the top left corner, what you see here is either an old fire break or what looks like to me a perfect skid row that's got food or grasses planted in it, probably for wildlife. The important thing about this photo is you see maybe the perfect 8-point buck walking down that thing. What I see is a perfect place to pull trees down when I'm ready to cut. What matters here is if that's important for you to leave, you need to make sure the timber buyer or the logger knows that that's something you don't want disrupted when you're actually cutting your timber. On the top right, you see there's an old truck in the middle of the woods. That's not fun to put your saw in. You need to know that area if you're looking out. Down on the bottom right, it's kind of hard to see, but about the middle of the picture is an old grave. That's actually a grave that Dave and I found on a piece of property over in Berkeley County. We want to know about those. If you're coming to cut your property, you want to know where the cemeteries are, so we don't run over someone's grave. It can be a protected area. And then the last picture I've included here down at the middle, it's hard to see, but right in the middle of the picture, there's a little green something. That's actually a pine tree. So this is a tree that was just planted in a stand that was just planted on this tract. You would need to be able to tell us, like, hey, just so you know, I planted trees over here. So when you're pulling my trees or when you're running your equipment across, please don't run over my 2-year-old trees, because then you start over. And you don't want to do that, because somebody could go, oh, that's a nice open spot. I'm going to put my deck here. So I'm going to bring all the wood and I'm going to stack all the wood right here. And then somebody else comes out and be like, you just stacked this whole stand on a brand new stand of pine trees. And it sets you back, 1 to 2 years, however long it takes to recover that. So next slide, please. Access. So this is another question that we get from a lot of people. Access for a timber stand, it has to be large enough for logging equipment and trucks to come through. It can be already existing, modified from existing, or created specifically for the job. Some common places that access can be used is existing roads from the county road, fire breaks that are pushed out. So we talked about fire breaks earlier, so they could come in with a bulldozer and push those out. Across old agriculture fields or power line right-of-ways. I've seen that done. That's not as common, but I have seen that used if it's large power lines, not your small power lines, but large power lines, like transmission lines or something. Which, coming across a right-of-way like that, you would have to get clearance from whoever actually runs that line. But next slide, please. So here's just some examples of access. So you can see someone was using that power line, and then there's a nice forest road there. Next slide, please. Some things to know about access: just because your car fit, your Honda Accord went in there, doesn't mean a log truck's going to go in there, okay? You got to think about what potential hazards there are or what areas need to be avoided. So you may say, there's an old wooden bridge that my granddad built that I can drive my truck across, but my 1.5 ton pickup can go across it. Your 30-ton log truck probably shouldn't, because it's going to end up in the creek. Or if there's old fence lines that you have to worry about, or culverts that have washed out, or fords that you have to drive across. A little note here, I said old ag field. Something to look out for, and I have seen this happen before, is a landowner sells timber on their tract, It says, I've talked to the farmer. They're good to go. You can just drive one straight line back and forth across. Great. Cool. We're going to drive back and forth across. What happens the day before the sale, the farmer comes in and discs that field. Well, what happens when you disc that field or you disc that power line right before the sale happens? You rip that hard pan. And once it gets wet, they sink straight down. So if you're going to use a field like that, it's important to know the timing of when you're going to come across and when the farmer is going to come across, so that can stay packed, because once it's been disrupted, it's hard to get a log truck across. And then sunlight the road. So I included this picture. Sunlighting means just open it up and let the sun hit it so the sun will naturally dry the property. So right here, it's kind of hard to see, but right past that last shadow on the right-hand side, there was actually, this is a property I managed over in Monster Corner, there was actually a wet spot. So what the landowner did was they actually cut all the trees on that side that blocked that road, that put shade on that road to allow the sun to naturally dry that grass road without having to do a ton of ditch work and putting in a culvert and all that. It's not effective everywhere, but it can be effective in some places. All right, next slide, please. So product classes, we get a lot of questions about this. I will say before I talk about product classes, I'm not going to talk about price. So prices can vary so much for so many different reasons across the state, and especially when you start crossing state lines. So I'm not going to talk about price today. If you have questions about price, I'm going to direct you to a website from the South Carolina Forestry Commission that lets you see last quarter prices, but price can be so varied I don't even want to talk about it, okay? So product classes, some major product classes that we deal with are pulpwood, so that's a 6-inch diameter. All of these are measured at DBH. So diameter would be diameter at breast height, so 4.5 feet from the base of the tree up. That's what DBH is. So it's measured at 6 inches. Chip and saw is 10 inches, to 13 inches, saw timber 14 inches. Some other classifications of products, some common ones, there are tons of other products. So you might have like pallet wood or posts and all that kind of stuff, but some other ones are super pulp, which is pulp wood with a 2x4 that's actually cut through the middle before they actually grind up the rest of it to make paper. And then poles, those are straight varying diameters. You could have poles, pylons, it changes a lot, and those are very specific. But what's important to note, these are typical product sizes, but they're not limited to this. And the reason I say that is because, say for example, you got a mill. We see here that saw timber is 14 inches. That mill may actually have a butt size minimum that says we will not take anything that's less than 15 inches at the butt or less than 16 inches at the butt. So that could raise the diameter at breast height. So it could vary there. So, or you might have a mill that says, okay, we take super pulp. So super pulp could change a little bit of your pulpwood class or your chip and saw class, or some mills don't take super pulp. Some mills just take regular pulp. So it could change there. The grade of your timber, so we're going to talk about grade in just a second. The market condition, if they are just struggling for wood, they could take some stuff they normally wouldn't take just because they have to have the fiber. And then your track location could affect some of it, because you might have, it's probably a rare scenario, but you could just be so far away from the sawmill that they up the price of pulpwood and up the size of pulpwood just because they can't feasibly carry it all the way to the mill. So next slide, please. So this is the a little bit about how it's done. So that's a loader. It has a boom and it's got a grapple on the end. You can actually see a log sticking out the back of there. It's actually loading on a truck. But this is what's happened. When you cut the timber, they bring it up to the deck, and on the deck, the operator of the loader will separate it out. So you can see there's all different sizes, butt sizes there. The important thing that I put in here, this is the power of having a consultant or having a forester work with you for this timber sale. Not everybody knows by sight the diameter of those trees. So having somebody that's there, that's operating this, that can actually come and check behind them to make sure it's done right, can say, hey, I just saw you put a chip and saw size tree on the pulpwood truck. So what's going on here? Or that was actually saw timber, but you put it on the chip and saw truck. Or that was saw timber, but you put it on the pulpwood truck. What's going on here? If you don't know that stuff, then it's not as easy to catch it. So that's kind of why I threw that in here. Next slide, please. So here's the product classes, just so you can see it. Pulpwood on the on the left there with chip and saw timber kind of pulled there together, and then some poles. So nice, straight, tall timber. Next slide, please. This is what I was talking about with grade. So the grade could be affected here. So if you look, you got forks where the tree actually forks in the middle somewhere, or tons of limbs. That limb there is probably at about 5 feet tall, and then crooks, so it turns and bends. That could affect the product class. While this might be, that tree there in the middle is probably 18, 20-inch diameter tree, but with those limbs, it's a pulpwood tree. It won't go saw timber because there's so many knots. It's poor grade. You'll be lucky they'll actually cut that for saw timber. They may just leave it because it is not a good grade tree. So those type of defects could affect the grade of your timber, which would affect the product class in which it's cut. Next slide, please. All right, clear cut. So just real quick on the two different, let me correct that statement. There's a lot of different types of harvest. The two that we commonly see and that most of our landowners have asked questions about are clear cuts and thinnings. So a clear cut here is they cut all trees within the sale area. So whatever the sale area, they cut everything that's merchantable. It's kind of an end of stand rotation. So once you cut it, the rotation's done. The pictures I included here are kind of cool pictures showing the piles and debris. That top picture is actually on a managed you contiguous. It's all pine trees, all the same size. When it's finished, it will more than likely look something similar to that. So you see there's still stuff out there, but it looks clean. The bottom is more of a natural stand. It was a naturally grown stand. Probably had more hardwood in it. With more hardwood, you're gonna have more limbs and debris that are left over. So it looks a little bit messy. The reason I included these two is because this is what it normally looks like. Common misconception is when I get it clear cut, it's gonna look like the football field that the high schoolers play on. It's not. It's gonna look like this when you get finished with it. Next slide, please. And this is the thinning. So two pictures here. You can see the takeout rows. You can see where the trees look a little bit thin. That's why it's called a thinning. They go in and they take out select trees to help promote the growth of the trees that are left. So the residual timber is promoted and given better opportunities to grow because of the trees that are moved. Those are usually that mid-rotation harvest that Steve kind of alluded to earlier, sometime around that 15-year in like an ideal situation. And then operator select or mark timber. So depending on working with a consultant, not working with a consultant, the consultant's stance on this, you could have operator select where the guy on the machine is actually deciding what trees to come out from between the rows, or it could actually be marked timber where the consultant's gone out with a paint can and said, this is the tree I want gone, this is the tree I want gone, I want to leave that tree, so I'm not going to mark it. Next slide, please. All right, some tips for sale as I wrap up here. I kind of got two things here. So the one on the left is really about hiring a forestry consultant. I work for the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, so I'm not up here trying to make a pitch to hire me to cut your timber because I'm not going to do it. But there's a lot of power in hiring a consultant. If you think about when you get you come into money, you come into a financial asset. Oftentimes you hire a financial planner to help you figure out how to manage that. It's the same thing with timber. It's an asset. It's someone that can help you plan that business, help you plan how to use it. So the benefits is they know the business. They know when to cut. Is this sand old enough to cut yet? Or is it need to be cut? It should have been cut a couple of years ago. The type of harvest, is it a thinning? Is it a clear cut? They're informed on the local markets. They're actually in the market in your area. Hiring a consultant that works around you. They know the season to cut, the buyers to work with that are reputable and can give you the best price, that do a good job, manage your property well. They're full service management, so they're overseeing that separation of product that I was talking about. They're making sure when they leave that the roads look good. And then they're helping you with your contract, making sure that you're protected in the contract as they are. And then they work directly for you. They're not paid unless you're paid. So the other side is if you sell on your own, there's nothing wrong with selling on your own. There are some risks of selling on your own. We would encourage to get a consultant. So remember that first slide, what do I need to sell my timber? We encourage a consultant. However, if you decide to get it on your own, get at least 3 bids. Get a good pulse of what the market is. If somebody comes knocking on your door, and I want to make sure I say this, someone comes knocking on your door, they might not be out to get you. It could be a legitimate timber offer. So there's kind of a stigma that the person knocking on your door is a bad guy. That's not the case. It could be a situation where someone is trying to take advantage of you, but it could be someone that's giving you a legitimate good deal on your timber. The only way you really know that is to check references on the buyers, if they have any, and get more than one bid. So you can say, hey, if I got 3 bids and 2 of them are pretty close and one is either way high or way low, there might be something weird about the way high. They could be offering me board foot, or these 2 other guys are offering me ton, or it could be that their price is just not good. So getting more than one bid will help you figure out across, is it a good bid? And then you can use the South Carolina Timber Mart South resources. I put this on here. This is where I was talking about prices. This is a resource that the South Carolina Forestry Commission has on their website. You can go on and check. Now, knowing that it's average last quarter prices. So it may not be current prices in your area. It's broken up across regions, but it's average prices for the previous quarter. It's a good tool, but it's not, there could be a lot of variables in that. And then have a contract. Make sure you have a contract. All right, next slide, please. And I said earlier, we're the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. We want to help you manage your future for you, manage your future for your future generations. So we would encourage you to have a plan when you cut your timber. If my plan is to replant that, how am I going to do it? Am I going to recut or replant this timber in this way? This is as soon as I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to do it. And we can help you do that. You can get a management plan through your consultant, or we here at the center will write your management plan through NRCS. So we can help you get that done to manage into the future. Next slide. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
We do have people that are online virtually, so if you could come to the mic if you have any questions, please feel free to come on up.
David,
Ask.
cases for both of us. Yeah, sure. No pun intended.
Hi.
Yes, ma'am.
As a WCA, we get questions about these stumps left
Sure.
behind.
Sure.
And who's responsible? Were they responsible for taking away the stumps? What are they supposed to do with the stumps? And then about neighbors surrounding them, cutting these trees for months at 5 in.the morning till 7 in the evening. Like, are you supposed to notify your neighbor because whatever, they have 100 acres or 1,000 acres and you're going through this for
Sure.
months?
Sure. So first question, the stumps. They are not responsible for taking the stumps. There was an industry a while back that, they use stump for lighter stumps, longleaf pine. That's not really in every contract. So the stumps that are left will degrade over time. That's where site prep happens. You leave them in the ground for long enough. When you spray them or you burn across them, or they use a bulldozer to do mechanical site prep, those stumps will be broken up and it'll return those nutrients back to the soil. So the stumps will be there when they finish cutting.
Because you'll see signs, flags hanging around, stump removal.
There are. Stump removal is a totally different process. It's sort of like tree removal. Someone's going to get paid, but it's not you for the stump removal. So
Happens in your yard.
yep.
Yes,
Yep.
and
Yeah,
now that-
large tract stump removal is normally done when it's like commercial. They're digging stumps to get ready to develop the land. They're not going to do that for a timber sale.
And all this noise and time and months of cutting it down, what are you supposed to do as a neighbor of all this going on?
That's an excellent question. Get to know your neighbors, I guess. I don't know if there's an answer to that one, unfortunately. Thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am.
I understand that landowners are supposed to know where their boundaries are. But when you sign a contract with the timber buyer,
Mhm.
is he required to go out and make sure where those boundaries are before the loggers come in?
I wouldn't say that he's required. It's probably encouraged he's going to be taking on the liability too. So most of them will check the boundary lines or want to know where they are. A lot of times you'll see them flagged. So they'll, depending on the timber buyer, they could go out and flag the line. It is a very variable situation, but they're not required necessarily. They're going to do their best to stay inside your lines.
Okay. So if the timber buyer flags and the loggers go over the line, who's liable? Me?
Depends on the contract.
Okay.
Yep.
Can the utility company come on your property and cut your trees down without your permission and put utility poles there?
You want to answer
Well, if they have eminent domain, perhaps.
Yeah.
It seems like they would alert someone. I think the utility company may have eminent domain, but they would alert a person before they're coming on their property. I know they'll come through a neighborhood, and there's often complaints about, oh, they hacked up my dogwood tree or whatever. And generally, what's happening is the utility company is actually hiring some subcontractor who tell them clear the lines, and that's with the person out there. There's no sense in yelling at them because they don't have control. They were told to clear the line here, and with the utility company, I would contact them if you felt that they had stolen some of your timber. But if it's within a utility right of way, which should be on a survey, then the utility company probably does have the right to do that. I don't know if there'd be any compensation involved.
Okay. And last question, can heirs property be surveyed and relocated to reduce the number of heirs before the title is cleared?
We have an attorney.
That sounds like a question for an attorney.
Okay.
Do you want to answer that, Josh?
Just because I'm close and I don't get to play attorney as much as I used to, so I know all the legal steps back there. Yeah, prior to clearing title on a tract of heirs property, those tenancy and common owners can transfer their interest and consolidate interest to a smaller group of tenants in common. They can also, after a title search, researches all the information available in the Register of Deeds office and the probate courts, and they can have a survey prepared, and that survey can divide the land up in accord with an appropriate plan that's agreed upon by everyone. So there are a lot of things that can happen while a piece of property is heirs property, but ultimately, and the center has done that from time to time when we're handling a case like that. But ultimately, you still will have to go through the process of clearing title for the purpose of making the land useful to you to its fullest extent. Does that answer the question? Oh, all right. All right, I'll assume it did.
I have a question in reference to clustering.
Okay.
What would you say to how can I say this? How far away do you have to, if you have property one place and some another, what's the distance you think that could be done?
That is a good question. I don't know if there's like a standard distance that's going to really make a big difference. It's going to be dependent upon the timber that's on the property and the quality of the timber and the amount, the volume, because it could be long tracts apart from each other, but if they're big tracts with lots of timber, that distance wouldn't necessarily matter. If it's smaller tracts or even larger tracts with very little timber on them, it's likely not as attractive necessarily to a timber arch. It's hard to say. I wouldn't say there's a standard distance. Dave, you have anything to add to that?
One comment I would make, because we've had this situation with a lot of our landowners, it can depend on how many times the logger has to move his equipment. As he said, the value. For instance, if the logger is on a 20-acre tract here, and he can move his equipment down a dirt road, a quarter mile to another 5 acres or 10 acres or whatever, he's probably perfectly willing to do that. But once he has to go across a major road, you're not allowed to just take your skidders and bulldozers across a paved road. Once he has to load onto a lowboy, go up over and unload and push out another deck, you're talking about $1,000, another $1,000. And so unless there's a ton of money there, so every case is different. We would look at that with someone and try to tell you, hey, I think that this can happen or this can't.
Okay, and with the tools you had showed an example earlier, the tape measure and all that other stuff, would you say that a metal detector is a good tool?
Yeah, most surveyors have a metal detector, and that can be very helpful, particularly if that rebar is the only piece of metal in the ground. But I've also found, this is not always, but oftentimes there will be like a dump pile near a corner. And so if you just have a ton of metal in there, it might not. But if you have a metal detector, I would definitely keep that in your quiver of things to use.
Hello, and thank you. What challenges would a landowner have whenever a county comes in and then starts to create easement? What are those challenges that they may face? You know, when you have the easement and they want to build the easement because of roadways, they want to start roadway.
Yeah, that might be another attorney question, but the other day that there was mention of that, Ms. Rivers, I believe, Dr. Rivers said something to the effect of, it might be helpful to get your land value. Like if someone's going to put an easement across your land and you know this, and they, they're saying, I'll give you, $1,000 per acre. And if you go find a buyer that's going to pay you $5,000 per acre, you can say, hey, you want to buy it from me or buy it from them? I don't know if that works, but she said it did.
Thank you. We're running a little bit over on time, so we're going to take a really quick 5-minute break before we come back with the next session. And if you have any additional, yes. If your question was not answered, or if you have any questions online, please email us at info@heirsproperty.org, and we will be sure to get back to you.